Welcome back to 1834. This is the sixth match of the first unofficial World Chess Championship. McDonnell is winning 1-0 and it's the first to win 5 that will take this match. Strangely, Bourdonnais is playing as white, the same as in the previous game. There may be a very good explanation for that, but I will save it for a later video. Today's guest commentator is Bill, therapist. Bourdonnais begins with d4. We have d5, c4 from Bourdonnais, the Queen's Gambit, and all gentlemen must accept a gambit. McDonnell is of course a gentleman, so he accepts. The last time we saw a Queen's Gambit was way back in match 4, game number 4, and at first they continue in the same way. e4 from Bourdonnais, and now e5 from McDonnell. Bourdonnais declines to capture this pawn, instead he pushes straight past to d5, and McDonnell plays f5, he loves to push his f-pawn. This is of course threatening the central e-pawn, so Bourdonnais develops and defends it at the same time with his knight. Knight f6 now from McDonnell, threatening the pawn a second time, but Bourdonnais does not defend here, instead he opts to recapture the gambited pawn on c4. McDonnell also develops his bishop to c5, clearing space for castling, and Bourdonnais wants some of that action, so he plays his knight to f3 as well. Now last time McDonnell played his queen to e7 and won after 36 moves. This time he captures the pawn on e4. Now this is threatening the knight here, so the knight moves forward to g5, and McDonnell takes the opportunity here to castle, as does Bourdonnais. McDonnell spots that this pawn is undefended, so he brings his bishop back to cover it, but meanwhile Bourdonnais jumps his knight into the nice outpost on e6, which of course forks the queen and the rook, although McDonnell does have this bishop which he can capture it with, and the pawn captures back. Now you can see that McDonnell is under a bit of pressure here with this x-ray on the king. Should the pawn move forward, he'll be in a lot of trouble. So he avoids this issue by bringing the king out of the line of fire, and Bourdonnais develops his dark square bishop to pin this knight. This knight can no longer defend this pawn, so it's going to be recaptured on the next move. McDonnell just continues to develop, and of course the pawn is captured. And McDonnell brings his queen to e7 to complete his development. Bourdonnais decides that he's just going to play a waiting move and see what happens next. What happens next is that McDonnell brings one of his rooks over to threaten the queen through the bishop. So the queen comes up to a4 and in return eyes up the knight and the pawn. Both of these pieces are defended, but McDonnell decides that he's going to try to strengthen the position by pushing a6. What he's really doing is threatening b5 and the fork here on the queen and the bishop, so Bourdonnais avoids this by bringing his bishop up to d5. Of course, this knight can't capture it or the white knight because it's still pinned by the bishop. What does McDonnell do? Well, he brings his knight up to d4, and he's threatening the advanced past dangerous pawn here. It's only got one defender in the bishop, it's got 2 attackers in the knight and the queen. So Bourdonnais decides that he's going to unravel some of this tension and capture the knight with the bishop. The pawn captures back. This bishop captures the pawn in the corner, and of course the queen picks up the central dangerous passed pawn. Now it looks like Bourdonnais will be able to pick up this pawn on the wing. There's 2 attackers on it and the rooks can't get into the corner because of the bishop. But Bourdonnais decides that he's going to take his time and strengthen things in the centre first. McDonnell pushes the pawn here, threatens the knight, so the knight gets out of the way, and now we have queen across to f6, getting out of the line of fire of this rook. And Bourdonnais eventually here captures the pawn. At this point, Bourdonnais is up by 1 pawn, so well done to him. Let's see how the game continues. McDonnell pushes his central pawn, but what he's really doing is revealing an attack on the corner from the bishop. Now, therapist says that the way to keep things balanced is to bring the knight to b5 and threaten the bishop and the black knight, but of course Bourdonnais wants nothing at all to do with him and instead plays queen to c4, which is admittedly a bit of a mistake, because knight f3 is on from McDonnell, and this threatens the rook and a double attack on the pawn in the corner. And you can't capture with the pawn, because if you do, you're going to get a threat of checkmate from the black queen. You can push the pawn, but the queen is of course going to capture the pawn and the threat is still on. In fact, the only way out now is to give up your queen by giving a check on the black king. And now you're just going to block, and the only thing to do, because the threat is still on, is to lose your queen by getting rid of the bishop. And of course McDonnell is in a completely winning position in that case. However, he does not play this knight to f3 move. Instead, he decides that he's going to sacrifice his bishop in the corner. But it's not really a sacrifice, because should the white king capture it, it's going to be all over very quickly. The knight is coming in, and if you don't capture here, the queen's just coming across for a very quick checkmate. But if you do capture it, it's coming across anyway and driving the king back down into the corner. That's check. The only way out of it is to capture with the queen, and you're going to lose the queen and be checkmated like this. So what does Le Bourdonnais do in this position? Well, he spots the problems and he doesn't fall for it. Instead, he brings the rook up to e3. McDonnell should probably back off the bishop now and consolidate his position a bit, but he wants to continue attacking and brings his knight into f3. So Le Bourdonnais captures it with the rook. Pawn captures back, but Le Bourdonnais now also captures the bishop. So the situation on material is that Le Bourdonnais has a knight and a bishop for a rook. There are even pawns, although McDonnell's pawns look a lot more scattered around the board. McDonnell brings his rook up to d4, defended by the black queen, but threatening the white queen, so Le Bourdonnais has to do something about it. He could move to b5, but instead goes for c5, which is a little bit of a mistake, because if this pawn is pushed and you capture, the rook is coming across, and there's all sorts of pins and nastiness going on for Le Bourdonnais to deal with. But McDonnell doesn't push the pawn here. Instead, he captures the g2 pawn and threatens the rook. And Le Bourdonnais just simply captures it with the bishop. Now the rook comes across and threatens the bishop again, but only once. There is the king defending it. And now we have f4 from Le Bourdonnais. Queen to g7, doubling up upon the bishop here, but Le Bourdonnais defends with his rook to f2 because the f-pawn is no longer here. However, the f-pawn is undefended effectively, so McDonnell captures it. And what does Le Bourdonnais do here? Well, if he were to bring his king down to g1, it would actually defend everything, because should the queen capture, you can capture back with the rook. Should the rook capture, you can capture back with the queen and remain defended here. However, Le Bourdonnais does not do this. Instead, he moves his rook across to e2, and now he is under a lot of pressure. For example, if you just bring the rook up to f3, you can't capture it here, because if you do, then the queen is coming across for a check, and you can only defend here with the bishop, and it's a very swift checkmate indeed. So McDonnell is in the driving seat here. However, he doesn't see this rook move, and the game goes on. We have rook to g4 instead. Of course, McDonnell is trying to triple up against this bishop here, but Le Bourdonnais just moves it across to h3, and now there are three defenders upon this square. The rook, the bishop, and the king. What does McDonnell do? Well, he brings his rook back to f4. We have rook to g2 now, threatening the queen, and by extension the rook. We have queen to d4, getting out of the way of that, offering a queen exchange, and of course Le Bourdonnais is happy to accept. The rook captures back. We have rook to f2 now, refusing the exchange on the black rook in the corner, and f4 from McDonnell. He's got a passed pawn here and he's not afraid to use it. We have a4. Likewise, Le Bourdonnais, this is defended by the knight, so the rook can't pick it up. And we have king to g7 trying to get out of the corner, but this time this is technically a blunder from McDonnell. For example, and this is quite long, but I think worth it, bring the rook across to g2, give a check. After the king moves, you go for the rook exchange, and after the rook exchange, you start pushing the wing pawn. Now, this rook can give a check. King can't move here because the pawn protecting this square, so bring him down to g1. The b pawn is lost, but the wing pawn keeps going, so the rook needs to try to catch up with it. It can be defended by the bishop, so the rook is going to try to get in front of the pawn. But instead of pushing the pawn here, you're going to bring the bishop back up to g2 and defend the corner square. It's not much that McDonnell can do now, so he's going to start bringing the king up to try to help. But push the pawn again. The rook is under attack. It can't go into the corner because of the bishop, so you're going to have to retreat and let the pawn queen. You're going to have to give up the rook now, and Le Bourdonnais is going into a bishop and knight endgame, which seems like a lot of hard work for Le Bourdonnais because he is French. So he didn't go for this, so let's get the board back into the position that we were in. Instead of giving the check here with the rook on g2, Le Bourdonnais instead brings the bishop to g2. And the game continues with rook to f8, and Le Bourdonnais starts pushing the wing pawn to a5. We have rook back to d6 to stop it coming any further forwards. Bishop to b7, trying to wedge itself up in there. Rook to f5, again threatening the pawn, so the pawn is going to move up to a6. We now have f3 pushing his own passed pawn from McDonnell, and king to g1 to try to get in front of it. But of course, McDonnell brings his rook across for the check here, so the king moves over to f1, and now we have rook to h6, threatening a checkmate here on the back rank. This pawn is covering these two squares nicely, so Le Bourdonnais goes to e1. Now, rook to h1 with check regardless, so the king has to come up to d2. We have rook to a1 now from McDonnell, getting behind this pawn, always keeping an eye on it. And we have king to d3, trying to make some progress this way. McDonnell also wants to bring his king towards the center of the game, so king to f6, but this walks into a check from the knight, which is defended by the bishop. So the king is going to have to go around to g5. The knight comes down to e3, threatens the rook, so the rook retreats to f5, but it's also sort of eyeing up this pawn on the wing. However, I don't think he's actually going to try and capture that. The knight comes across to c4, and McDonnell starts pushing his wing pawn himself, h5. The knight now comes down to a3 and blocks access to the pawn from the rook, so the rook comes back to d1 to give a check, and the king moves down to c2, which is, of course, threatening the rook, so it moves up to d8. And here Le Bourdonnais decides that he's going to go for gold and push the pawn one step forward. Now there's nothing that McDonnell can do to stop the pawn, so instead he brings his king forward one square and the pawn queens, so McDonnell is forced to give up his rook. The bishop captures it here. McDonnell continues bringing his king forward, trying to make something out of these two passed pawns on the wing. It's threatening the rook, so the rook retreats, but the king keeps coming. Threatens the rook again, so the rook backs off to d1. However, this pawn can't come further forward because it's pinned by the bishop. So McDonnell puts this pawn in the way to break the pin. It's covered by the rook. What does Le Bourdonnais do? Well, he decides that he needs to go around it. Bishop to b7, but the pawn comes forward now to f2. What does Le Bourdonnais do? This is quite sneaky. He brings the knight up to c4. Now, should the pawn queen, you're just going to lose it straight away with the fork here. Which is very nice indeed. So instead of pushing and queening, McDonnell brings the rook over to e6 to defend the upcoming fork. Le Bourdonnais plays knight to d2, and McDonnell decides he's going to try to push the wing pawn here. He's got two passed pawns. He's hoping to do something with it, although Le Bourdonnais has his own plans to stop this. He pushes b4, the pawn keeps coming, so does the b pawn. What's going to happen here? Well, McDonnell pushes once more, but Le Bourdonnais captures the c-pawn, which comes with check. And the king is forced to move. It can't come forward to help the pawns because of the rook on the back rank, so he backs off to g3, and the bishop wedges itself in the corner and protects everything. That is amazing. We have rook to b6 to try to block this pawn, and now rook to b1 to back it up. We have rook back to b8, and now the pawn advances. And it was here that McDonnell decided that enough was enough, and he resigned the game. So well done Le Bourdonnais for coming back to win this game after all of its ups and downs. It's now one game each in this sixth match. And bad luck to McDonnell for losing it, although there is a sting in this tale which I will tell you about after this match is finished. I'll see you again next time.